Hi there, Dave Whittier here from Ally Emergency Management, and welcome to the last in our video series on the operational planning process. In this video, we will be discussing wargaming. What is a wargame? At its most basic, a wargame is an interactive simulation. There are a number of people discussing an operation or a solution to a problem. They often play roles in this or take parts of it. And it's a really great way for you and your planning team to visualize an operation or its critical parts. It can range in complexity from a bunch of folks sitting around a table talking about it to sophisticated modeling software. The great thing about a war game, if it's done properly, is it can generate ideas that you haven't thought of up to this point, and it will give you a much more detailed, in-depth understanding of a problem than perhaps reading alone could give you. Why wargame? Well, like I mentioned, it gives you an opportunity to visualize your operation and or its critical parts, and that includes pointing out which tasks are most vital to the operation, and it may allow you to identify key tasks and decision points that were previously overlooked. It can also expose previously unseen threats or risks or opportunities and help you develop measures to deal with them. It builds familiarity with the operation, and it helps everyone who participates in the war game understand how the operation is going to flow. And this is really, really true for an operation that involves teams from several different organizations who need to understand how they're going to contribute to the plan. You might have people involved in a war game that were never involved in the planning process. So that's the true strength of this. It can help you identify people and resources and activities that must be synchronized, and will give you a clear means of comparing the options that you come up with to solve your problem. The war game, as I mentioned before, can vary in complexity, but there are some components that should be included no matter what. Regardless of how complicated your war game gets, you need to have a clearly stated purpose, and you need to give some guidance to the participants. As I mentioned before, you may have people involved in the war game who were not involved in the planning up to this point, and they need to have a way of orienting themselves to what you're doing. The war game should have some means of representing the environment that you're operating in and the teams that are involved, including your competitor, if that's applicable to your particular problem. In a military environment, this is almost always a map. It may or may not be in your particular situation, but you're going to have some way of representing all the players in this particular solution. There needs to be an agreed upon timeline for action and an agreed method of play. So you need to articulate how the war game is going to work, and everyone's got to buy into that, or at least understand it. And a clear set of rules for capturing and displaying findings, so that when you learn things from doing this war game, those learnings are not lost. Again, even if your war game is less or more complicated, there are some general rules that need to be followed. You need to be objective and unbiased. And the point behind that is, and we've talked about this before, don't fall in love with your plan. The plan is going to be stressed in the war game. and you need to make sure you don't get defensive. The idea is to come up with a better version of it at the end, and this is the only way that you can do it. You're going to have a team lead, and if there are any unresolved issues, the team lead makes the final decision, but avoids interfering. So we want to make sure those creative juices are flowing, but there needs to be somebody at the end who has the hammer. Follow the timelines that are articulated. So we don't want this thing to run on forever. And this one's important. Play the plan as it's written. And what I mean by that is, as you are wargaming a plan, you might find a gap or you might find an issue, and you don't want to fix it on the fly. You want to record it, come back to it later. Otherwise, you get a fractured idea of what the plan is if you keep on patching it while you're trying to wargame it. You need to record everything to make sure all the lessons learned are captured. You want to be able to record the advantages and disadvantages of each course of action. And this is specifically when you are applying the wargame to the COA development stage, because at the end of it, you want to come up with the COA that's most appropriate. And you need to be able to speak clearly and briefly. Avoid sidebar discussions and don't get into fights. And I have seen this before, where participants in a war game will start to argue about, well, no, the enemy force would never do that, or my friendly force would never follow that, that's against doctrine, etc., etc. And that is a guaranteed recipe for your war game to go down the drain. So you gotta have a little bit of discipline in this, but once you do, you get a good result at the end. Preparation. As is the same for any other activity, you want to take some time and prepare. Make sure that your room is set up with all the tools that you need. If you're going to use a map, make sure the map's laid out. If you've made assumptions, make sure that that's up somewhere where everyone can see it. If you've got various courses of action and you can represent those diagrammatically, put the COAs up on the wall so people have that visual representation. If you have enough people, and this may or may not be the case, you can break them into teams. If you are wargaming your response to COVID, for example, you can have one team representing your organization and one team representing COVID. And that just gives them an opportunity to dive more deeply into what that particular group will do. And it gives you a more fulsome product in the end. You can also assign one team to each course of action, and you can play it through that way. As part of the preparation, you want to plan the war game and how it's going to be conducted. And that includes things like turn length, not only the length of time that the turn's going to take during the war game, but the amount of time the turn represents in real life. So you might have 15 minutes to discuss one day of the operation, for example. You want to identify the order of participation. So an order of march for your teams, who gets to speak first and next, and that is the same all of the time. You're going to want to identify rules for conduct, how you're going to discuss one group's action and the next group's reaction and that first group's counteraction, if applicable, and how you're going to capture the data and in what form. To that point, you're going to want to assign a scribe to make sure that all of your lessons are captured. There will be a facilitator, and maybe if the problem is complicated and there's a lot of people, you might want to assign a referee who can listen to everyone's points and make a determination as to how a particular turn is going to turn out. Similarly to the things that you have to do to plan the war game, there are some things that you should do to introduce the war game. Remember I said some people may have had limited planning time, and this is going to be their first exposure to your problem is in the war game. So make sure that everyone starts off on the same sheet of music. Describe the conduct, how it's going to run. Identify the output, what you want to get out of this particular war game. You want to set the stage, and that means make sure everyone understands what the particulars of the environment are that you're working in, what you have as a team, what are your resources. If you've got a competitor, then you need to describe what the competitor is doing as best of your knowledge. If this was a COVID type scenario, you'd want to review where we are in terms of our understanding of the virus and number of infections and where the government is going in terms of lifting restrictions and that sort of thing. Make sure you confirm the mission. I think we talked in an earlier video about beginning with the end in mind. Make sure everyone understands the end state in terms of what success looks like. And if you're doing this as part of your COA development, make sure everyone understands the criteria you're going to use to compare the various COAs when you wargame them. Each turn is going to have a standardized conduct. The facilitator is going to explain where we are at the beginning of the turn and how we are situated. The rule of these war games is the side with the initiative goes first. So the side that's got the greater freedom of movement is the one that starts the turn. The usual cycle is action, reaction to that action, and then counteraction to the reaction. Sounds a little bit confusing, but you'll get the hang of it. After the turn is done and everyone had a chance to contribute, you then analyze the turn in the context of the criteria that you set up to compare your COAs. In earlier videos, we've talked about branches and sequels, and branches and sequels are basically subplans that often get their genesis in the course of wargaming. And they answer two separate questions. A branch plan answers the question, what if? So we're wargaming our marketing strategy against our strongest competitor. And in the course of a turn, someone says, well, what if they actually start a new ad campaign? Oh, well, then maybe we need to plan for that and have our own ad campaign or something along those lines. That becomes a branch plan, which has the same foundation as the initial plan, but goes in a slightly different direction. A sequel answers the question, what then? We get to the end state and we're super successful and we've still got some resources. Is there something we can do to leverage those resources to continue to ensure success? What then? And that becomes a sequel plan. Remember, I mentioned earlier that war games can be used in two stages of the OPP, and that is COA development and plan development. So when you're wargaming in COA development, the focus is on identifying the course of action that best ensures success. You're going to identify opportunities for branch plans and sequel plans. There are going to be some points for clarification, inevitably, that you may have to get some more information around. And this is your opportunity to synchronize activities, your activity with your competitor, your activity with the various stages that the government medical planners are anticipating for the development of COVID, etc. When you are wargaming in the plan development stage, it's a slightly different focus because now you're only working on one course of action, but you're going to get into it in detail because at the end of this, you want to have a plan that you can actually start to issue some instructions off of. So the branches and sequels that you identified in the COA development stage, you're actually going to start working out the details. The planning team and all the participants should be able to fully envision the entire operation. This is a chance to give everybody a common operating picture. And you're going to identify shortfalls and conflicts and issues, etc., with this particular course of action so that you can get the best possible plan put together before it becomes direction. That is Wargaming, and that concludes our video series on the OPP. I hope it's been useful for you. It's been a fun exercise for me. As always, if you've got any questions, please write me an email at the address on the slide. Take a look at our website at www.yourally.ca. There's some good resources there, and I wish you all the best of luck in applying the OPP to your particular challenge. Thanks again. Bye now.